Uvaha, which is once again Ukrainian for Achtung, and shades of Iranu and Ufafu, unfortunately. I'm afraid.
But I think in the interest of solidarity to our Ukrainian friends, I think it's absolutely right.
Absolutely, but it's just the way my mind works, Jim, unfortunately.
I know.
Anyway.
And then you start rubbing your thighs. And
anyway. Welcome to We Have Ways to Make You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. Last week we talked about events in Ukraine in 1941, and there's clearly a lot of interest because our download numbers went through the roof. In fact, Tim Mercer got in touch to say this is definitely the episode I was waiting for the last few days. So much of what's going right now seems to directly linked to Putin's interpretation of history. I think that's undeniable, and I think it's that thing that you've got to remember is that Putin's acting rationally within his worldview, isn't he?
Yes.
That's always the thing you've got to remember, that when we go, oh, he's crazy. He's crazy to believe in sort of in ethno-nationalism, blah, blah, blah. And the idea of one central eternal Russian and Rus, the Rus people, that the Ukrainians and the Russians are part of one indivisible, blah, blah. No, that's what he thinks. He believes that. And so, and also, he's probably...
It's his own personal truth.
It's his own personal truth. Yes, I mean, God.
But it is his own personal truth, but it's also absolute bullshit. That's the problem. And that's the great frustration, isn't it?
But you know, ain't that the way? But also some of his strategic estimations of what the Western response would be, you know, are rational. But what's happened is everyone's changed their minds. Is you know, every now and again, you know, you look at appeasement. Everyone was into appeasement right up to the moment where they suddenly weren't. You know,
yes.
Suddenly
in August 1939, it was a different colour fish altogether.
Well, March 39, really. 39, you know,
yes,
it's just that everyone is that this can actually this can happen. Is that things that were true, right? You know, or things that everyone agreed on can suddenly change in a heartbeat. And I think that's obviously one of the things that's happened. Is all his estimation? You know, people saying, "Oh, you know, Russian money has bought British acquiescence in all this." Yes, but only up to a point. And the point.
Well, the Nord Stream 2 has brought German acquiescence.
Yes, exactly.
I think the German response has been much more interesting than anybody else's, if I'm brutally honest. I mean, talk about political volte-face.
Well, and you wonder if Merkel was still in power, whether she'd have been able to do that politically, and whether it's the fact that Scholz has the room for manoeuvre, as it were.
Because he's a new boy.
Because he's a new boy, you know, and it gives him to, rather than being continuity, he gets to do something, you know, powerful and moral, like she did when she let Syrian refugees into Germany. Blah 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 blah. Anyway, I agree with Tim's point, though. It is all linked to Putin's interpretation of history, which, after all, so he's acting rationally within that framework. I mean, this is
within that irrational framework.
Well, exactly. But this is it, isn't it? You know, we often talk about, you know, why the Nazis made the decisions they made the way they made them. Well, they were operating within their frame of reference and frame of reason and their estimations of their enemies and all that sort of stuff. And so you can argue their decisions are rational. I mean, Adam Tooze, after all, argues that Barbarossa is rational because the German economy is, you know, running on empty, and conquering France has delivered nothing economically. In fact, it's caused them more problems than, you know what I mean? So
there's no question about it. In June 1941, he's got absolutely no choice. He's either got to end the war, or he's got to go into Russia, because there's no other alternative for getting the shortfall in supplies that he needs.
Yeah, exactly.
There's two massive flaws with that plan. The first one is that this is the point where Hitlerian and Nazi ideology gets in the way.
Yeah,
and the second flaw is that they're not ready. And they've done what they did in the Battle of Britain, which is underestimate your enemy.
Yeah,
and it's always better to overestimate your enemy. And what I would say is that what the signs are so far that the West has overestimated Russian military strength.
Yes,
because what you're looking at when you're looking at strength is you're looking at numbers of artillery pieces, numbers of rockets, numbers of warheads, numbers of jets, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
What you're not looking at is logistical capacity
and stuff, and all that stuff.
and all that stuff. And because until you've tested it, you don't know what it is. And also, that's not the stuff that people kind of get excited about. But actually, there should be, I'd have thought in military analysis, there should be much, much, much greater emphasis on what is their logistical organisation and how do they work things. I think that kind of operational side of things hasn't really been followed through in quite the same way, given quite the same attention as numbers of armaments has. Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you see trainloads of civilian trucks heading to the front line, you kind of know, you're up the creek. It's going badly wrong because obviously those things are not armor plated and they're not used for.
But isn't it an issue that you judge people by your own standards? So if you're a Western analyst and you count 450 tanks, you assume, don't you, that the 450 tanks come with the logistical, gubbins that you would provide yourselves for your own 450 tanks, as it were.
Yes, you do. And just to go back to the Battle of Britain again, I mean, one of the reasons why Park and Dowding in late August 1940, beginning of September, think they're in such big doo-doo is because they're assuming that a German Staffel is the same strength as a British squadron. It isn't. It's half the size.
Yeah.
And so their strength is half what they think it is. Effectively, I mean that's sort of a bit simpler. It's a bit more complicated than that, but
this stuff is easily done. After all, when states don't have actual access to each other's information as best they could. Now, Patrick Rutherford wrote in to point out, it strikes me that there are some parallels between 30 Corps stuttering advance up Hell's Highway and the slow progress of the Russian armoured convoy column on Kiev. I would disagree.
I would disagree completely. I don't think there's any similarity at all.
30 Corps hot knife through butter by comparison. And after all, the differences far outweigh the similarities in terms of air superiority, weather. That actually the weather may go wrong for the airborne forces during Market Garden, and as everyone knows, but they don't go wrong for the ground force. It doesn't go wrong for the ground forces. 30 Corps are able to press on without any weather obstacles to what they're trying to achieve. And do get to Nijmegen on schedule. It's just the
there are scenes though, aren't there? There are scenes of sort of heartbreakingly familiar to black and white photographs from
the
war in the Soviet Union. I mean, whether it be shelled out apartment blocks with huge great hole in the middle of a road and rubble everywhere. We've seen black and white versions of that from 1941 to 3, for example. Or to yesterday I saw some footage. Yes, all that as well. And I remember yesterday I saw some footage of a Russian gun emplacement, artillery emplacement that had just been completely shredded. Well, you take out the colour, kind of sort of half close your eyes, and it could be 1942 all over again. It's amazing. And the columns of burnt out vehicles and stuff. From that point of view, it looks hauntingly familiar. And it's weird, isn't it, that in an age of nuclear power and thermobaric bombs and hypersonic weapons and all the rest of it, there's much of it which actually is pretty much the same. Field artillery kind of firing shells long range without accuracy. By accuracy.
Well, and the thing
cetera.
obviously there's question marks about a lot of this, about the veracity of some of these photos. But some of the pictures, and obviously, the Geneva Conventions say that you're not allowed to take pictures of prisoners of war, but there's been plenty of stuff of prisoners of war. And the thing I
would say is that not a lot of them are not quite as lean as they were in 1940.
No, that's true, but
including the rather large of girth Russian fighter pilot,
the chubby pilot. Yes, I mean, that's peculiar in itself. He's their top gun, who's obviously been at their top buns. But the thing I'm struck by is that prisoners of war, when they've just been captured, throughout history look the same. That dejected look, that look of that they're of fear and their numbers up and all that sort of stuff. I think, and relief and all those emotions. You see those pictures could be the black and white images that we see from the Second World War as well. Although obviously, although we don't know yet because we haven't because this event isn't complete, is it? We don't know what's happening to prisoners of war, do we? Which, after all, on the Eastern Front is an extremely difficult subject and grim subject.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so what we thought we'd do, because last week we did our damnedest to not get our crystal ball out, because I think that's it's not. I mean, to be honest, it's not our remit. And also, I went to the comedy awards last week.
Did you win?
Yeah. No, of course not. No, there isn't a best Second World War podcast category at the comedy awards.
I didn't mean that. I meant that.
No. I went along and I had to give out an award and everything, and that was very interesting because I did my little bit with Robbie Rinder, Judge Rinder, right? And we had a line about how he had no backstage chemistry at all, which everyone laughed at, and then a lot of people thought was true. It was a line we were given, all right. Anyone who saw that, but he's done a load of programs about the Holocaust because his family was caught up in the Holocaust. He lost lots of family members. His family lost lots of family members, and he's done some TV about that. So we talked about that a bit. But the thing is at the start of the awards ceremony, because Zelensky's a comedian, there was a tribute to Zelensky right at the start of the program, saying,
nice.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm sat there thinking, events are moving very quickly here. This is recorded on Wednesday afternoon last week and went out on Saturday.
By the time
well, that's what I was thinking. And I said that to I turned to my manager and said, I mean, this is brilliant. They're doing this and they have to do this.
But high risk strategy.
But especially in the giddy world of modern television. Anyway, so that was one of those. So that's why we don't want to get into our crystal balls here, because we're interested in the Second World War and not in pronouncing particularly on what might happen.
And it's not our place to do it. And the truth is, just like everybody else in the world, we don't know. No idea what's going to come. Well, we're not best placed to give a proper assessment of current military operations, are we?
No, I think
it's the Second World War, not contemporary war.
Exactly. I think we know as much as the Russian High Command do right now. So
which is not a lot. Not a lot.
so it would seem. Anyway, so let's talk about Ukraine in the Second World War and talk about 1943, because after all.
Yeah, because we did 1941 last week. We did the giant encirclement of Kiev.
Yeah.
And then, but they claw their way back. And it's an amazing sequence of battles which takes place following the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. From August to December is the big sort of reconquest of half of Ukraine.
And after all, the Battle of Kursk happens in Ukraine.
Yes, it
doesn't it?
Yeah.
And this is I think the other thing to remember, we're in the midst of all this, especially when you've got the Putin government going on about denazifying Ukraine, all this sort of stuff, that most of what happens in the war on the Eastern Front happens in countries in Ukraine, Belarus, places like that, rather than necessarily than in Russia. And we often think of it as the Russian war, don't we? But this is a war that happens in Ukraine. The greatest battle of the Second World War, and I've got my inverted commas out there, is the battle at the Kursk salient, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly one of the, if not the most famous, probably, Stalingrad and Kursk are the two that everyone kind of remembers. And if you don't know much about the war on the Eastern Front, those are the two bits that you do know about. Kursk was absolutely monster. It was this huge, great bulge that had come out in the line, and following Soviet advances in the spring of 1943. Yeah. And so what that means is your line suddenly has got three sides to it rather than one, if you see what I mean. And so the German plan for Kursk was to straighten that line and reduce the bulge. But I mean, what we're talking about here is one that's sort of, 100 miles by 100 miles by 100 miles. It's just like really, really massive. Yeah. And the guy who was put in charge of kind of defending Kursk was Rokossovsky in the main. And he basically turned it into the lines of Torres Vedras from the Peninsular War, with these huge defensive works. I think there was 7 lines of defences. And it was sort of, it was known that the Allies were kind of sort of, building up for something in the Mediterranean. And so right from the word go, Hitler said, okay, well, we'll launch Operation Citadel, but the moment it looks like it's going to go, the Allies land somewhere in the Mediterranean, we call it off. and that's exactly what happened, basically.
But what's interesting about the Kursk salient, about the Kursk battle, though, is this is the some capability the Germans have now. 1941, they launched Barbarossa, massive gains. 1942, again, great gains, but essentially stymied by Stalingrad. But they get to the Caucasus. They do. If you're just looking at a map and measuring it with a tape measure, like Hitler seems to be, they do very, very well. But all that they're capable of in 1943, this is, in a strange way, the sort of admission that what this offensive amounts to is an admission that Germany is done, because they're trying to tidy up 100-mile, like you say, this front. They're trying to tidy up this salient, which, given the bounds they made the 2 previous years, is pretty small beer, isn't it?
Yeah,
actually, and again, they don't know what the Russians have. Hitler, they think the defenses are 20 kilometers deep, Soviet defenses, but they're like 110 kilometers deep at their
yes,
deepest.
And then behind say you do reduce the Kursk salient, then behind that there's even more defensive positions.
Yeah, the steppe military district, which is a whole other defensive belt. Yeah, they did. Yeah,
say that Kursk is not in Ukraine; it's in southern Russia, but it's right on the border, and it's absolutely wedded into the subsequent actions in Ukraine. Yeah. It is this absolutely monster battle. The interesting thing is they barely get to the second line of defences. And, the Germans are so far from winning. All they do is... So the plan is you've got this sort of big square bulge pointing westwards, and it literally is a square. And so the idea for the Germans is to attack from the north and from the south at the pinch points, at the base of the salient, of the bulge.
Try
but they just don't really get anywhere. There's all this exciting new work that's been done on the Battle of Pokrovka, which is the greatest tank battle ever, also in air commas. And the various people have been doing some fantastic work on that and proved that actually it wasn't. But in a way, it's sort of irrelevant because well, it is and it isn't, because it's become part of folklore and it's part of the kind of Putin version, isn't it? Of the war,
and it's
which is wrong.
Quite clearly part of how the Red Army and then its success, the Russian army, has told itself what happened and has built its tactics and reputation on, which is it's one of the problems with wonky history, isn't it? Is that learning the real story would reward you more. And there's been all sorts of sort of currents, like you say. So Roman Toppel's written that really fantastic book about Kursk, and building on the sort of history that gets you into trouble if you're a Russian looking at this stuff. Because the archive was open for a little bit and then it was closed again, and the losses the Red Army suffers in the Kursk battle, they're basically, they win, but the losses are astonishing, completely boggling, aren't they? No,
they absolutely are. I think what is really, really interesting though is the Kursk battle also marks a sort of sea change, because this is the moment where the partisan organisation really kicks in. Yeah. And I suppose, we all know that there's been sort of, government involvement in resistant networks in Europe, but nowhere is it sort of better organised and more strictly organised than it is in the Soviet Union. And basically, in the second half of 1942 and into the beginning of 1943, you see a much greater level of control from Moscow, which is sort of coordinated and organised by the NKVD and which is obviously the forerunner of the KGB and the Red Army. And it becomes a combined command. And the central staff of the partisans is in Moscow. So it's a bit like kind of sort of London controlling kind of SOE or whatever, or SIS. But then this control is exercised through regional headquarters. And the reason you've got so many is, of course, because in these giant encirclements in 1941, you're not encircling absolutely everybody. You can't possibly. Yeah. So lots of people are kept behind, not picked up as prisoners. If you're going to be picked up as a prisoner by the Germans, what do? Run to the woods, right? Yeah. And so you've got all these fighters there, and they're still weaponized, and arms are being dropped in and all the rest of it. But what you see is, by the middle of 1943, there's probably about 200,000 partisan fighters, all of whom are organised. Yeah. There's no shortage of men or indeed women fighters in that. Yeah. And then on July the 14th, so at the sort of, just after kind of Citadel is being called off, which I think Citadel's called off by the Germans on the 12th.
Yeah.
Stavka, which is the kind of high command of the Soviet Union armed forces, asked the partisans to launch Operation Relsovaya Vonya, which is the rail war. That was pretty good, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's very strong.
Yeah. And this lasts until September, and the rail war is really, really interesting. And the numbers of railways that are cut is just absolutely phenomenal. So there's 96,000 partisans specifically cutting German rail links.
Yeah.
And they cut them more than 200,000 times in this period. And you can imagine how that absolutely screws up your logistical chain if you're German.
Yeah.
Who are so dependent on the railway. On the railway. And the partisans are being used for intelligence gathering. They're being used for reporting on success of air targets, air targeting and all sorts of stuff, as well as sabotage. But this rail war absolutely cripples the Germans, who were already crippled. And it's one of the great. It's almost the fourth arm of the Red Army.
Yeah.
It's hard to overestimate how debilitating the partisan wars are. And one of the reasons why you have Orador and Montesole in Europe, these terrible slaughters, is because of the absolute brutal violence of Soviet partisans against the Germans and the debilitating effect it has. So obviously, when Das Reich get to France, southern France in June 1944, and they're being harassed by French resistant fighters, they just think, oh, God, seen all these guys before in Russia, there's only one way to deal with them.
Yeah.
And that's with extreme brutality, which is what they did. I mean, I remember talking to this German machine gunner from Dusseldorf called Franz Marson. He was a baker by trade. He was a lovely guy. But he was in, I remember he's saying during the retreats of 1943, he said he had this guy who was his sort of sidekick on the machine gun called Peter, and he was a sort of intellectual guy, short-sighted, should have been at university and not in a uniform.
Yeah.
And he said they used to sort of change over, he'd fire and Peter would feed them, feed the belts of ammunition, and then they'd switch over. He said they'd just switched over when Peter got hit by a bullet and was evacuated out. And the next day they were tramping back and they went past these burnt out ambulances, and the driver had his, which was completely burnt out, and the driver had his hands tied to the steering wheel with wire before they'd set it on fire. And then all the patients in the back had been laid out on the side of the road with their penises chopped off and put in their mouths and all killed. And one of them was Peter. So Franz said, as you can imagine, when I came to Italy and suddenly there's more partisans, I wasn't massively sympathetic to their cause. You can see how that all works. But, it's all part of the kind of violence begets violence kind of thing. But those partisans are really making a massive difference. And it is that issue of supply, which is what does for Germany in 1941, which is also still doing for them in 1943.
We need to take a break right now. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, of course. And we are doing everything we can to talk about Ukraine, not now.
So the follow-up from Kursk, it means that they're already weakened after the Citadel offensive.
Yeah.
But their situation is made worse by this rail war that's being conducted by the partisans.
Yeah. I mean, it shows, doesn't it, that that when you're occupying another country and you've not been invited, so to speak, things can get very, very complicated, can't they? And
very quickly.
And in fact, you can fight. I mean, after all, the Kursk battle itself, to come back to it, is so peculiar because after all, the Germans inflict incredible losses on the Russians, on the Soviets rather, yet the Soviets win. And the Germans make none of their gains that they're seeking to. They don't disrupt the salient, and then they're counterattacked, and And, even though they inflict incredible losses on the Soviets, and then you can have a battle all you want. It's the rest of it that's even more difficult because you're an occupying power.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the difference now, of course, is that comms is so much easier than it used to be. Particularly now for the Ukrainians, thanks to Elon Musk. It means that they are staying. It's just extraordinary, isn't it? That one man in America has got that power. But anyway, that's sort of by the by. But absolutely, if you're in a country that doesn't want to be conquered and doesn't want to be subdued and does see, I think for resistance to work, there have to be a certain sort of conditions, and one of them is a sense of hope that actually there is a kind of light at the end of the tunnel. And there is a future worth fighting for and laying your life on the line for. And the other one, of course, is control. And in the case of the Soviet Union, by the middle of 1943, you've got both those conditions.
Yeah. And the Germans are, they are running again. This is the best they can do in 43 is attack the Kursk salient. They aren't going to get to Moscow. They aren't going to get to the Caucasus. All that sort of ambition has gone out of what the Germans can do. And after all, they're on their arse. You look at in May the Bomber Command drop more bombs on Dortmund than are dropped on Britain in the whole of 1943. So
it's absolutely amazing.
In terms of sort of in terms of your kind of parity.
Yeah,
and then you've got Sicily going on and all this sort of stuff, and if you're the Germans and you're trying to look at, or Hitler, and you're trying to look at things in full in the round, you're buggered. It's the truth.
Yeah. No, you really are, and then you've got to make choices about kind of what you defend tenaciously and what you kind of let slip. And they decide that Orel is the town they're going to hold on to, which is in the kind of northern part of the Kursk salient, just above the salient. And this is Rokossovsky attacks this. This is Operation Kutuzov. The Germans do fight tenaciously, but it's still taken on the night of the 3rd and 4th of August. They do a night attack, come in, boom. Yeah, that's that. And as we know, the Germans didn't really like doing night operations, which is why the Russians do them quite a lot. Then there's Operation Rumyantsev, which is to the south towards Belgorod and Kharkov. And this is Konyev's steppe front, but also Vatutin's Voronezh front. Yeah. So, you've got these huge fronts, these which is what we would call an army group. Yeah. Now sort of, who have had a comparatively easy time of it in Kursk are now suddenly sort of unleashed and powered forward. And Belgorod, because it's covering, it's southwest rather of the base of the Kursk salient, and it's sort of protecting Kharkov, which is obviously in Ukraine. Yeah. And is the kind of next big city on the list. So again, the Germans fight very, very tenaciously. But it's completely surrounded by the 5th of August, and that same day they enter the city. And when they get there, they found 3,000 dead German troops. Yeah. So not wounded, dead. I mean, that's just a colossal number. And then, they march on towards Kharkov, and Kharkov is well, the Germans are sort of, stunned by the speed of this. And by the 22nd of August, they're kind of pulling out. And again, the Red Army does an attack that night to surprise the Germans, and also to prevent the Germans from destroying the city as they retreat. And by midday on the 23rd of August, it's game over. So Kharkov, which is obviously one of the big cities, and I think it's the second city, isn't it, Ukraine? Yeah, it is back in Soviet hands, and it's a big moment. So suddenly they're back in Ukraine, and then it's this kind of, okay, so what are we going to, the Red Army's point of view, it's like, how do we keep this momentum up? How do we keep going? How do we keep pushing and actually get to Ukraine? Now, as we all now know, the Ukraine is kind of riddled with rivers, and of course the Dnieper is the biggest of all, and it's this mighty concourse which kind of flows, for the most part, kind of roughly from the kind of north in a kind of south easterly direction, but then just at the just north of the Sea of Azov. It then cuts backwards, westwards, and comes out of Kherson, which of course we now all know about, and into the Black Sea. But it was this huge, and it basically sort of splits Ukraine in two, eastern and western halves.
Yeah.
And so the next thing is that, okay, well, let's get up to draw up to the Dnieper, clear kind of eastern Ukraine, and take Kiev. And Kiev is important because it's the third largest city in the Soviet Union. You know, it is this really, really ancient city. It is full of, you know, amazing buildings and architecture, and you know, it is, as we were talking about last week, it's this city that Stalin just refused to give up, which is why the Kiev encirclement happens. Because he doesn't give up, he doesn't sort of abandon it when he should do.
Yeah.
And basically, this takes them until kind of this whole series of battles for the Dnieper takes them up until December 1943. But it's really interesting because they take Donbass to start off with in kind of August 1943, and then start pushing westwards towards the Dnieper. And it's how do you get to Kiev? You know, you can't just go straight into Kiev. You're either going to have to attack it from the north or the south, but you've still got to get across this mighty river to be able to do that. And getting across and getting a foothold and then bringing enough forces across when you're constantly under enemy fire is obviously the really tricky challenge.
Yeah. I mean, but what's remarkable about this is that, I mean, again, the sheer numbers involved in these battles.
Yes,
because when you say a front, because we're used to talking about army groups in Western Europe, what's a front compared to an army group, Jim?
Yeah, well, it's really numbers, but what you're getting is you're starting to get tank armies, you know, guards tank armies. Yeah. So this is 100% mobilized pretty much.
Yeah, the Voronezh front is the 3rd Guards Tank Army, 1st Tank Army, 4th Guards Tank Army, 1st Guard Cavalry Corps, 4th Guards Army, 5th Guards Army, 6th
Cavalry
Guards
Corps
Army.
Is still horses, by the way.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah. I mean, so just the scale of this.
Yes. Well, I mean, you know, what you've got north to south in this area of southern Russia around Kursk down to kind of, you know, the Sea of Azov, Black Sea. You've got the Bryansk, but this is by kind of August, September 1943. Yeah. So you've got the Bryansk front, which is General Markian Popov.
Yeah.
You know, a general that no one's really heard of anymore. Then you've got the Central Front, which is Rokossovsky, you know, friend of the show.
Yeah.
Generally kind of, you know, probably the most amazing commander in the Red Army in the Second World War, I would argue.
Yeah.
Then you've got Vatutin's Voronyezh front. You know, he's pretty damn good.
Yeah.
Then you've got the Steppe front, which we've already talked about, which is renamed the Ukrainian front on the 10th of October. And that's Konev. You know, again, he comes to the fore, isn't he? He's a big key player in Bagration and Fall of Berlin and all the rest of it. And then you've got the Southern Front, which is General Fyodor Tolbukin.
Yeah.
That Southern Front is... So what we're talking about for the Battle of Ukraine, really, and the Dnieper battles, is the Voronezh Front and the Steppe Front / Ukrainian Front, as it becomes renamed. That's what we're talking about here. Yeah. But I suppose the really interesting thing is they decide to go first for an assault across the Dnieper south of about 60 miles south east of Kiev at a place called Bukrin, Velkihi Bukrin, which is on the western side of the Dnieper. And you know, you have to understand that this is sort of like the Rhine. I mean, it's just freaking enormous. You know, it's hundreds of meters wide. Yeah, it's such a major thing to get across this. You know, the logistical challenges of making a bridgehead over this are, you know, in a way as great as sort of getting across the channel. Not quite like that, but I mean, you know, it's a major operation. It's a major defensive barrier. And how do you do that? Well, you create a bridgehead, you enlarge it, you expand it, you break out. Yeah. And how do you think they decide to do this?
Well, they're going to use. Well, they're going to do what they've had something up their sleeve all this time, which is because after all, it was the Soviets.
They were the founders.
They were the founders. So what they do is they do an airborne landing, don't they?
They absolutely do.
And it's an absolute catastrophe, isn't it?
Yeah.
It couldn't be it couldn't go worse. They're basically all hunted down and killed, aren't they? Essentially.
Yeah. Essentially, yeah. 4,575.
Yeah.
Nearly all of them are killed.
Yeah. I mean, exactly.
And the interesting thing it is the last. It's the last airborne operation in Europe using Soviet troops.
Right.
Ever until 10 days ago or whatever.
Till the other day. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Because I mean, and they see
read your history, Vlad.
But when you go to
there are warnings.
But Jim, when you go to Moscow and you go to the Victory Museum there, which is the most extraordinary building, incredible building, and there are these huge murals of 4 scenes of the Second World War, and or maybe it's half a dozen. I can't remember anyway. But one of them is of there's taking the Reichstag, I think. But the one that had me standing going, really, is seizing the Dnieper and its airborne troops successfully seizing the Dnieper. And you think, well,
it's successfully in inverted commas. That's the point.
Well, no, it's the heroic capture of the Dnieper by Russian paratroopers. And you sort of think, well, I mean, after all, there's a school of thought that says, D-Day in the end goes very well, which proves the efficacy of using airborne forces. Whereas in fact, when you could then examine how well 6th Airborne or 101st or 82nd do on the night, and you could go, well, yeah, if you want, those airborne operations go well, but add or subtract them, what actual difference in outcome would you get? You can argue, but because the whole thing's a success, using airborne works, right?
Yeah.
So, they get across the Dnieper. So using airborne forces is a success, James. There you go. That's how you.
Well, yeah. I mean, it is interesting what they've. So they land and they do secure this as a brief bridgehead.
Yeah.
Then there are crossings in boats and rafts which are constantly under fire and which are absolutely slaughtered, but they do manage to kind of, because they're Red Army, they can take hits that others can't, and so they do get across. And this is the airborne landing happens on the 23rd of September 1943, and by the 12th of October. They've got quite a lot more. They've got 6 tank corps over, and they've got 14 rifle divisions. Now, a Red Army rifle division is not 15,000 men. It's more like
but still,
it's quite a lot though. So they've got by this time they've got a 3-to-1 advantage of infantry and a 6-to-1 advantage in tanks.
Yeah.
But the problem they've got is they can't reinforce it with firepower because the firepower is all coming from the other side of the Dnieper, and it's just too far. So you've got your little besieged bridgehead, and it's breaking out. To break out successfully, you need your artillery over the other side of the Dnieper. And they just, the logistical problems, the difficulties of getting across the river under constant German artillery fire is just too problematic, and so it doesn't work. So Vatutin initially says, okay, even for us, this is not working, calls a halt on the 15th of October. But Zhukov, who's overall charge, says, no, give it another crack. So on the 21st, they get some guns over, and they bring up a whole barrage of artillery for on the far side, on the eastern side of the Dnieper, right close to the banks. Yeah. And so behind this barrage, this long range barrage, they give it another go on the 21st of October. But again, it's raining and observation is poor, and they just can't exploit any local successes enough. It's the same. It's effectively the same problems you had on the Western Front in the First World War.
Yeah,
and so again on the 24th of October, the offensive called to halt. And interesting, there is this incredible website called I Remember. .ru, and if anyone wants to look at it, I'd urge them to look at it really quickly before it gets shut down. But there is it's in Russian, but there's an English option, and there's various eyewitness testimonies there. And one of the people they've got on there is Natalia Peshkova, who was a medic, a frontline medic, first in a infantry division and then in a tank division, and she's also a sort of political. She's a komsomol. Komsomol, rather, a political person within a communist within within this division, and clearly treated with a huge amount of respect by the blokes. She's wounded 3 times. I mean, she's sort of hitting the buttocks, then she's hitting the head, then she's wounded again in the arm or something. I mean, she's obviously a formidable lady, and quite aristocratic in background, interestingly. But she's very interesting because she's in the Bukrin Bridgehead during this period, and she's talking about about seeing the Katyusha rockets firing for the first time. They'd heard a lot about them, and that kind of gave them a bit of confidence boost. But she says, when you see a bomb falling, you feel like it is directed at you. Actually, it is falling above you, but can land anywhere. Most people lay face downwards and hid their head in their hands. I always lay belly up. I had to watch what was going on. Lots of people were being killed in the Bukrin Bridgehead. I had a friend in a neighbouring battalion. They had 280 graduates from a military college. After the Battle of Bukrin, only 16 of them were alive. Bear in mind, they had been trained. Our recruits after the battle were the boys of 16 and older from the nearby villages. They knew nothing and were scared of everything. These were our fresh faces. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway, she's tough as old boots. She gets separated. As they're trying to sort of move out of this bridgehead, and gets lost in, she's sort of missing in action for 3 days. Yeah, but manages to. At one point, they're hiding in a hayrick in a field. Her and her friend, and German tanks start crossing it, and the tanks are so close they can hear the Germans talking, but they don't get discovered. I mean, it's amazing reading this stuff. It's absolutely fascinating. But anyway, the denouement of the failure of the Bukrin Bridgehead, that it doesn't work, they can't get to Kiev, as they go. Vatutin goes, okay, right, we'll just have to completely change tack. What we'll do is we'll attack from the north instead. So they have this huge logistical operation to move everything. It's not just 60 miles north to Kiev; it's beyond. Yeah, they then have to cross the Dnieper, where it is, it's actually 7 at Layutes, which actually again is in the news at the moment. So this is where the Dnieper is 700 meters wide.
Jesus.
Yeah. But it's just north of the Irpin, which is where they've blown that bridge and where that family were killed yesterday. Yeah. So this is the same bit north of Kiev where the Russians are now, coming down an hour, and actually the access of advance coming, so with the Dnieper on your, to the west of the Dnieper is exactly the same access. Yeah. And the challenges of getting enough troops, but more importantly, support troops, is absolutely enormous. But it's really, really interesting because it's Moskalenko who's the commander of the 38th Army. And Moskalenko is the guy who designs the battle plan with Vatutin's say-so. Yeah, yeah. And what he decides to do is to attack on a very, very narrow front, a 3-mile front, and get a huge amount of artillery to punch a hole. The action, to punch a hole, and just blow away the kind of, the German defences north of Kiev. Yeah. And the reason he chooses this is because there's quite a lot of forest there, and he thinks that'll hide the Germans when they won't see them coming. And to keep this really, really concentrated fire. But what he also does is, and this is a sort of, a hangover from Rokossovsky's plans in 1940, at Kursk in 1943, in the summer of 1943. This idea of the concept of the deep battle, which is where you get your first echelons and are stacked up with your second echelons, so that your first troops can go forward with their first echelon, and then the second echelon is going to come hurtling straight past, so that you can keep that momentum. Which is, obviously is exactly what the Russians have not been doing this time around. Yeah, and the speed with which this second echelon comes through when they do actually launch the attack is absolutely amazing. Yeah, yeah. And so they launch this battle, and the idea is to kind of be there by the 7th of November. And 7th of November is the great anniversary of the October Revolution. 1917, which obviously seems a bit odd because it's in November, not October. But
yeah.
But that is the day, and they launched this incredible attack. And there are 380 guns lined up over this very, very narrow stretch, which is incredible. 380 per kilometre.
God.
So that's one every 2 and a bit meters.
Yeah.
In terms of concentration of firepower.
God.
And it just completely blows away the Germans. There's just nothing left at all.
Yeah.
But then it's the I think is it the third? Yes, the third Guards tank army, which then follows through, and they have a little bit of stickiness. So what they decide to do is actually again they're going to do another night operation, and they're going to go with all their sirens wailing and all their lights on. And so it's like the kind of sort of the ride of the Valkyries. It's like the sort of the Dementors coming towards you.
Yeah.
So although that means that the Germans can see them coming, there is just this sort of absolutely terrifying siren of just this massive armor coming towards them, and it absolutely does for them. And and by the middle of by the 7th of November, exactly as planned, Kiev is back in
Soviet hands.
In Soviet hands, and the city is interesting. It's this kind of like this. There's ruins everywhere and fires burning, ugly piles of rubble. Where once had been beautiful buildings and so on. The famous Kiev was famous for its avenues of chestnuts and poplars and what have you. They've all been burned and destroyed.
All been destroyed
or cut down or whatever. And in a city of 1 million, there's only about 125,000 people left. And when the Red Army troops get to the center of Kiev, it's like this ghost town. It's like this sort of post-apocalyptic place of sort of still burning panzers and SP guns and blackened Charles Hulks and rubble absolutely everywhere, and not a soul to be seen. And it's only as they start to kind of sort of come in numbers that slowly the Ukrainian residents starts to emerge from the cellars, and slowly but surely these kind of sort of subterranean dwellers in this kind of besieged city finally emerge.
City starts to re-emerge. On that I Remember site, there's an account of a paratrooper from that drop over the Dnieper. We had to jump from 300 meters in order to land faster, and so that we would not be scattered, and the pilots, moving away from anti-aircraft fire, climbed 2,000 meters. We were told that we would be behind enemy lines for 3 to 4 days. We had to seize bridgeheads and hold them until the reserves arrived. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before. Landed at a distance of 25 to 30 kilometers from the calculated point. Right, so they're off to a bad start. This is a chap called Nejivenko Peter Nikolaevich. Right, and it goes on, and they're jumping from the Douglas copy, the DC-3 copy that the Soviets have. The whole brigade should be parachuted within a radius of 7 to 10 kilometers, and the pilots scattered it for 100 kilometers from Richishiv to Cherkasy. And instead of brigade actions, we had to act in small detachments that are easy to destroy. So scattered drop, they lose their critical mass on the battlefield. I mean,
concentration of force.
No, exactly. I landed right on the outskirts of the village, and next to me were 6 more people. We landed and signalled. We had clear digital passwords for signals. I shout 15. He must answer 10. Everything is clear. 25. You shout to me 10. I 15. Everything is clear. 25. Your brother. Everything is clear. In addition, each paratrooper had flashlights to give light signals. We landed on the outskirts of the village, unfastened our parachutes, and immediately entered the battle with the police. Probably they did not notice our drop. And then they went into the forest. We had such a good guy in our detachment, Nikolai, who showed us how to cross the Ross River. So basically, they end up hooking up with partisans because they've got no option.
Yep.
In the evenings, we met one grandfather Ignat, and asked where the partisan detachment was. And who are you? We are paratroopers. Why are you in uniform? Already from February 1943, shoulder straps were introduced. So that's the thing of there's marks of rank returning to the Red Army.
And the epaulets,
Yeah, they showed him the documents. He said, well, then let's go. He was specially sent by the commander of the partisan detachment to meet the paratroopers. So basically, they end up behind enemy lines with an anti-tank rifle, trying to cause trouble. At first, such columns passed that we were too tough. And then the observer in the tree responded, the small column was coming. We have distributed who hits what. The PTR hits the last car on the right, the first on the left. We throw grenades at the column itself. The column approached. I shot at the lead vehicle, and the PTR has incendiary bullets. So that's an anti-tank rifle, isn't it? Just hit, immediately flares up any tank with the exception of the Tiger, the Panther, and the Ferdinand. So don't try blowing up the heavy stuff. And this is what they end up doing. Amazing. Because and hanging on and waiting to, for basically the main battlefront, rather than being relieved for the main battlefront to catch up with them.
And that's what happens eventually, right?
Yep. And he gets a Partisan of Ukraine medal for fighting with the partisans.
Isn't that amazing?
In Ukraine.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
The other thing I think has been really interesting about all this, what's going on at the moment, is the sort of, people reporting that the Russian troops are kind of lacking morale and weren't prepared for this and hadn't been warned and all this kind of stuff, which is in sharp contrast to the lead troops on any major offensive that the Red Army is sort of carrying out in 1943.
Yeah,
you have these political commissars, and they do go around, and one of the key things, and Natalia Peskova is very interesting about this in her account. Talking about the importance of morale and keeping everyone up and making, and they're saying, a lot of people weren't doing it for Stalin, they were doing it for the motherland. This idea of patriotism was incredibly strong, that you were doing this for some bigger cause. And where the Red Army was very, very successful was recruiting brilliant writers and speakers to come and give pep talks and write in kind of, Pravda, and also the Krasnaya Zvezda, which is the kind of Red Army newspaper equivalent of Crusader and stuff, and Stars and Stripes. And one of the guys who was right at the front, sort of briefing 38th Army and 3rd Tanks Guards Army, was Ilya Ehrenberg, who's quite a famous writer. He's he's Ukrainian, Kiev born, but a non-practicing Lithuanian Jew.
Right.
And, he's kind of rubbed shoulders with Lenin in Paris and, before the First World War. And he's quite a big name, and obviously feels very, very strongly about Kiev being retaken. So he goes and visits the troops and gives these series of talks. So it's not Monty going around giving, it's not the generals giving talks. It's these journalists, these writers, which is such an interesting concept. Yeah. And his speeches are then written up and put in Krasnaya Zvezda. And one of them on the eve of Kiev gets published. And it's worth just reading out a little bit of it, because it says, we must save Kiev. We get ahead of the incendiaries. We must outrun death. Life awaits. It awaits in deadly anguish. Without Kiev, there is no Ukraine. There is no homeland without Kiev. Here beside the venerable Dnieper, formidable battles have raged. The fate of Kiev depends upon them. Our destiny too depends upon them. If we drive the Germans from Kiev, they will retreat to Germany. The Germans want Kiev to become their strong point. Kiev must become their grave. Amazing stuff. I mean,
but doesn't that remind you of the of the rhetoric we've heard of, and obviously what we're not hearing at the moment in this crisis is the Russian rhetoric, particularly, but that flowers will grow where you die here, all that stuff.
Exactly. It's absolutely amazing, isn't it?
But like I say, we've not been hearing the Russian end of things. What their nationalist denazification rhetoric sounds like. I expect it sounds not dissimilar.
Get rid of the Nazis again.
Yeah, although their problem is they're simultaneously claiming Ukrainians are their brothers and killing them, which of course is a tricky thing. But again, all we can do is sort of look on and not get our crystal balls out.
No, what we can tell you is that life under German occupation in Kiev. If you were a Kiev resident, it was unbelievably brutal. Lots of public executions. Yeah, the Germans needed absolutely no excuse to round up completely innocent people and execute them for kind of crimes of partisans. Inverted commas. There was almost no education. Because they're in dimension, they don't need to be educated. There's no point. So that was kind of, obviously Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. Everyone's starving in the city.
Yeah.
It's hard to put into words just how brutal life in Kiev had been in the kind of sort of 2 years that the Germans had occupied it.
So brutal that it manages to help people get over the fact that they've had the Holodomor done to them only in the previous decade. The Germans are going something to get people to think this is a war of national survival, given that their nation has only just survived something horrendous,
appalling as the famine. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's quite something, isn't it? I mean, talk about mismanagement. It's incredible.
Anyway, I think that's probably all we've got time for today.
It's quite a long one, actually. Yeah,
it's quite a long one. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot to say.
There's a lot to say, and again, I mean, who did we talk to about? It hasn't been out yet. About how the war on the Eastern Front is the war of many countries. There are many countries and many nationalities and peoples caught up in it. You can't just call it the Soviet Union versus the Germans.
Bastian Willem.
That's Bastian Willem making out the point that a Bavarian might have a different view of what Germany is to a Prussian, for a start, Anyway, that's it for today. This Thursday, we're heading further east as we're joined by Rana Mitter to talk about China's role in the Second World War. It was a great chat. Incredible. Like, that was a proper that had proper Oxford tutorial stuff going on in it as well. So don't miss that. And on Sunday, we've got the last episode of this series of family stories, but keep your stories coming in and we'll start work soon on Series 3 for the summer. Thanks again, as ever, for listening. We'll see you soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.